Medieval England, the 12th to 17th centuries, was a time where power was absolute, and those who betrayed it faced gruesome consequences. This particular execution method wasn't always the standard for criminals, but for traitors, those who attempted to overthrow the crown, plot against the king, or commit high treason. It was the worst fate one could endure. Back then, treason was considered the most heinous crime. It wasn't just a betrayal of the king or queen. It was a direct attack on the kingdom itself, something that could tear apart the fabric of the entire nation. The roots of the hanged, drawn, and quartered punishment can be traced to the reign of King Henry III in the 13th century, though it was during the reign of King Edward I that the method became more formalized. It was believed that the punishment had to reflect the severity of the crime. In an age where the public eye was always watching, the state wanted not just to kill the traitor, but to make the execution a public spectacle. The gruesome nature of the punishment ensured that the message was heard loud and clear. This punishment wasn't just about death. It was about humiliation and making an example out of those who dared challenge royal authority. The idea was that a traitor's body would serve as a public reminder of the consequences of betrayal. It wasn't just a judicial act. It was a spectacle designed to instill fear, showing everyone the lengths the crown would go to protect its power. The process of being hanged, drawn, and quartered was as horrific as it sounds. It wasn't a quick death. It was a slow, agonizing, and torturous ordeal, meant to break the spirit of the condemned before they even met their end. First came the hanging. The condemned would be led through the streets, often in a public procession. Crowds would gather to watch the spectacle, with the prisoner typically tied to a cart. Upon arrival at the execution site, the condemned would be hanged by the neck. Just enough to strangle, but not fully. This brief, excruciating strangling was meant to torture the person physically while leaving them alive to experience the other stages of the execution. But this wasn't the end. Far from it. After the hanging, the next step was the drawing. This was a gruesome term that referred to the act of disemboweling the victim. The executioners would rip out the organs, some say the heart, others the intestines, and often burn them in front of the crowd. This act symbolized the removal of the person's inner life, making it clear that they had been erased from both body and soul. The drawing was a public ritual of death, designed to ensure that the traitor's body was no longer whole or intact. But the most chilling part came next, quartering. This step involved literally cutting the body into pieces. The victim was tied to 4 horses, each one positioned at a different point. The horses would then be urged to run in opposite directions, pulling the body apart. The body would be divided into 4 parts, often the head, arms, and legs, and these pieces were sent to different corners of the kingdom as gruesome reminders of the consequences of treason. In some cases, the head was displayed on a pike or hung above the execution site for all to see. The final piece of this horrifying ritual was the public display of the parts. The body wasn't just destroyed, it was humiliated, paraded in front of the crowds as a clear message from the crown. This is the fate of those who would betray their country. William Wallace is perhaps the most famous victim of this brutal execution. Known to most as the Scottish hero depicted in the movie Braveheart, Wallace led the Scots in their fight for independence against the English in the late 13th century. He achieved several key victories, but was eventually captured by the English in 1305. Wallace's trial was a farce. Accused of treason against King Edward I, Wallace was denied a fair hearing. Despite being a patriot fighting for his homeland, he was labeled a traitor. The punishment for treason was clear and incredibly brutal. On August 23, 1305, Wallace was taken to Smithfield, London, where he was hanged until nearly dead, then disemboweled in front of the crowd. His organs were burned, and his body was cut into pieces. His head was placed on a pike at London Bridge, as a grim warning to other would-be rebels. Wallace's body parts were sent to various parts of Scotland, further humiliating the man who had become the symbol of Scottish resistance. Wallace's execution was a tragic end for a man who had given everything for his country, but it also cemented his place in history as a symbol of resistance against tyranny. Dafydd ap Gruffydd, the last sovereign prince of Gwynedd in Wales, is another example of a tragic figure who met the brutal execution of hanged, drawn, and quartered. Known for his fierce opposition to English rule in Wales during the 13th century, Dafydd had long fought against King Edward I's expansion into independence. Dafydd's fate was sealed. On October 3, 1283, he was executed in a manner befitting his defiance as a Welsh prince who had dared to challenge English rule. His execution was meant to serve as a powerful warning to others who might consider rebellion. After being dragged through the streets of Shrewsbury, he was hanged, drawn, and quartered. His body was divided into pieces, and his head was displayed on a pike in London, just as Wallace's had been before him. Dafydd's execution was especially symbolic because it marked the end of Welsh independence. His brutal death was part of a broader strategy by Edward I to crush Welsh resistance and bring Wales firmly under English control. James Scott, Duke of Monmouth, was the illegitimate son of King Charles II and led the Monmouth Rebellion in 1685 in an attempt to seize the throne of England. The rebellion was driven by Monmouth's desire to take the crown from King James II, who was unpopular due to his Catholic faith. Monmouth's forces were initially successful, but after a decisive defeat at the Battle of Sedgemoor, he was captured and brought to trial. Monmouth was executed on July 15, 1685, and though his execution didn't follow the exact same drawn-out method as Wallace's or Dafydd's, it still bore similarities. Monmouth's head was separated from his body with a single stroke of the axe, and though the manner of his death was relatively quick compared to the horrific ritual of hanging, drawing, and quartering, the public nature of his execution, combined with the dramatic events surrounding the rebellion, made it infamous. Monmouth's death marked the brutal suppression of the rebellion and signaled the strength of King James II's rule. In a striking contrast to the earlier executions of William Wallace and Dafydd ap Gruffydd, Monmouth's execution was more of a swift decapitation, but the larger political implications were similar. Rebellion against the crown would result in merciless punishment. While hanged, drawn, and quartered was the most gruesome method for executing traitors during the medieval and early modern periods, the methods of execution evolved over time. As societies advanced and became more civilized, some of the more barbaric forms of execution fell out of favor. By the 19th century, executions began to focus more on methods that were considered more humane by the standards of the time. In Britain, for example, hanging became the primary method of execution, and it wasn't until 1965 that the death penalty was abolished for murder in the UK. The transition from public executions to more private ones also reflected changes in public attitudes, where executions were once seen as a means of asserting authority and instilling fear. By the 19th century, they were viewed by some as cruel and outdated practices. The shift towards more humane forms of execution, and eventually to the abolition of the death penalty in many countries, marks a fundamental change in societal values. Despite the decline of the hanged, drawn, and quartered method, the legacy of its cruelty continues to shape how executions are perceived in modern times. The brutal and humiliating nature of these executions left an indelible mark on history.